I woke to the sound of Silas 2 perfect. To still end when I looked outside, something felt off. The flag that usually fluttered in front of my porch was gone. The small garden lights I'd placed along the walkway had vanished. And then, I noticed that the oxygen tank by my bedside wasn't humming. At first, I thought it was a power issue, maybe a circuit trip, but when I reached for the plug, I froze. It wasn't unplugged by accident. The cord had been pulled clean out and looped around the handle like someone wanted to make sure it stayed that way. My hands trembled as I looked around, realizing this wasn't a random act. It was deliberate. Someone had been inside or close enough to know exactly what that tank meant to me. And in this neighborhood, where every blade of grass and every paint shade needed HOA approval, I already knew who would have had the nerve to do it. They called her Karindi, self-appointed enforcer of every rule, every fine, every threat wrapped in a smile. But this time, she went too far. What she didn't know was that her attempt to control the neighborhood would unravel something far bigger than any of us could imagine. Because what happened after that morning didn't just expose her, it changed everything. And the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was fear. What would you do if the person meant to protect the neighborhood became the one endangering lives? Before everything spiraled into chaos, life in Willow Creek felt like the kind of suburban calm people dream about. A cul-de-sac lined with identical mailboxes, neatly trimmed hedges, and the faint hum of sprinklers hitting asphalt each morning. For years, I believed I had found peace here, a small, well-kept home where I could focus on recovery, surrounded by neighbors who waved, smiled, and pretended to care. After years of hospital visits and oxygen tubes, this house wasn't just a home, it was my sanctuary, my breath of freedom. I had moved here because it promised stability. The HOA brochure called it a harmonious community of shared values, a place where people respected each other's space and safety. At first, I believed them. I kept my lawn mowed, painted my shutters the approved shade of beige, and paid my dues on time. Life ran on quiet rhythms, mornings, with coffee on the porch, evenings listening to the cicadas, and a sense of safety in knowing that rules kept things orderly. But beneath that calm, there was something else. You could feel it in the glances that lasted too long, in the whispers exchanged over trimmed fences, and in the way the HOA board meetings dragged on about things that shouldn't matter, like the exact color of mulch or the length of holiday lights. Among the faces at those meetings was one that always seemed to carry a hint of power, a woman named Karen, the HOA president. Her voice was the loudest in every vote, her smile the brightest when enforcing fines, and her confidence unmatched when reminding others she knew the rules better than anyone. She was the kind of person who turned guidelines into weapons and called it community improvement. I stayed polite, always cooperative, because in neighborhoods like this, peace often depended on staying invisible. But that's the thing about control, it only feels stable until someone refuses to bend to it. My small acts of independence, like leaving a single potted plant by my porch without prior approval, became points of discussion in the next HOA newsletter. Once, a letter arrived in my mailbox reminding me of oxygen tank placement compliance. I laughed it off then, assuming it was just another one of their meaningless notices. I didn't realize it was the beginning of something darker, because while I was trying to live quietly, someone else was keeping track of what I planted. When I came home, and how long my light stayed on at night, the illusion of safety began to crack in tiny ways. A missing garden light, a warning about visible equipment on private property. The HOA had rules for everything, but no rule prepared me for the feeling that I was being watched. Even my neighbors started acting differently. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others gave those soft, knowing smiles that said they'd heard something, maybe about me, maybe about how my oxygen tanks disrupted the visual uniformity of the community. That's what Karen was good at, turning the ordinary into ammunition. Still, I tried to believe it was all just noise, until the day I caught her standing at the edge of my driveway, clipboard in hand, staring at the medical equipment beside my porch like it was a code violation. She didn't say a word, but her look said everything, and in that silent exchange, something shifted. It was the first moment I realized that peace in Willow Creek wasn't real, it was managed, controlled, and threatened by those who mistook power for purpose. I should have seen it coming then. The letters, the warnings, the surveillance, all of it was building towards something. But when the moment finally came, when she crossed that final line, it wouldn't be about rules anymore. It would be about survival. and what happens when the illusion of harmony shatters into something far more dangerous. It started small, almost invisible, the way most controlled dust-like cracks under the paint that you only notice once the whole wall begins to crumble. After that silent encounter at the edge of my driveway, I tried to move on, convincing myself that maybe I had imagined the hostility in Karen's eyes. But the following week, the first letter arrived. It was slipped under my door instead of mailed, folded perfectly in half, printed with the HOA emblem. The language was polite but sharp, the kind that made you feel guilty without knowing why. Notice a violation. Unapproved medical equipment visible from public walkway. It listed a fine of $50 per day until the oxygen tank was relocated or appropriately concealed. I remember staring at that sentence, my breath catching, not because of the fine, but because of what it implied. To them, the device keeping me alive wasn't medical, it was unsightly. I reached out to the HOA office for clarification, but every call went unanswered. When I finally got a response by email, it wasn't from the board but from Karen herself. All residents must maintain visual consistency, she wrote. Rules exist to protect property values and community standards. No greeting, no empathy, just that single cold line. I told myself not to let it get to me, to stay calm, to follow the right channels. I sent medical documentation, a letter from my doctor, even photographs showing how discreetly the tank was stored, but none of it mattered. A week later, a second notice arrived, this one stapled to my door. Non-compliance. The fine had doubled. The letter ended with a line that didn't sound administrative at all. Continued disregard for HOA policy may result in further action. Further action. Those two words echoed in my mind. Things escalated quickly after that. Neighbors who once waved began to look away when I passed. The man across the street, who used to help me carry groceries, suddenly pretended not to see me. Someone started leaving HOA pamphlets on my porch with certain sentences highlighted about clutter, uniformity, safety hazards. It wasn't just about the oxygen tank anymore. It had become something else. Control. Karen's control. I filed an appeal, thinking reason would prevail. The board hearing was held in the community center on a Wednesday evening. I arrived early, clutching my folder of evidence. But as soon as I walked in, I felt it. Every head turned, every whisper paused. Karen sat at the front, flanked by her allies, the same people who nodded at every word she said. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. She read the violation aloud like it was a crime report. I tried to explain my condition, how the equipment wasn't a choice, but a necessity. She smiled politely, nodded once, then announced the board's unanimous decision to uphold the fine. "We appreciate your understanding," she said, but I didn't understand. I walked home that night under the glow of streetlights, each one flickering slightly, like they too were judging me. By the time I reached my porch, I noticed something odd. My security camera light wasn't on. The feed had been cut. I checked the connection, the cables, but everything was fine. Someone had manually unplugged it. The realization hit me like ice. Someone had been close enough to touch my home. Again, I changed the locks, added new cameras, and moved the oxygen tank inside despite the inconvenience. But even that didn't stop it. The next day, another letter. Improper interior storage of medical equipment may constitute a safety hazard. The HOA reserves the right to inspect for compliance. That was when I knew they weren't just enforcing rules. They were trying to break me. The following weeks felt like living under surveillance. Cars would slow down in front of my house. Sometimes the same ones, sometimes unfamiliar. One morning, I woke to find a small orange sticker on my mailbox. Notice, property under review. It wasn't official HOA stationery, but everyone knew what it meant. Karen had started her whisper campaign. The board meetings grew more personal. Rumors spread that I was endangering others with hazardous equipment. A neighbor even suggested to my face that oxygen tanks could explode under heat. I stopped attending gatherings, stopped answering the door. Every sound outside made me tense. The walls of my sanctuary began to feel like a cage. Then, one afternoon, I saw Karen standing on my porch again, clipboard in hand, tapping her pen against the railing. I didn't open the door, But she didn't leave either. She just stood there, looking around, jotting notes, muttering something about community safety. The next day, a notice appeared in my mailbox. Scheduled inspection, mandatory access required. I refused, citing privacy laws. But that didn't stop her. Instead, she called the fire department, claiming there was a potential safety concern at my address. Red lights flashed outside my window that evening, and as firefighters stepped onto my lawn, I saw her standing across the street, watching. When they left, finding nothing wrong, she smiled, turned, and walked away like she'd accomplished something. That was the moment I realized she wouldn't stop until she had control of my home, or until I left. But leaving wasn't an option. This was my home. I had fought too hard for it, and I wasn't going to let a petty tyrant take it from me. So, I began documenting everything, every letter, every photo, every strange event. I started talking to neighbors quietly, discovering that I wasn't the only one targeted. Karen had fined a veteran for a flagpole an inch too tall, a single mother for a toy left on her porch, and an elderly couple for improper holiday decor. She ruled through fear, and people complied because it was easier than fighting back. But I wasn't like them. I couldn't afford to be. One evening, I caught movement near the side of my house. I grabbed my phone and recorded through the blinds a figure crouched by my generator. When I stepped outside and shouted, the person bolted. The next morning, the generator line was severed. My security footage showed nothing. The feed had gone dark again just minutes before. I reported it to the police, but without evidence, there was nothing they could do. That night, I sat in the dark. The faint hum of my backup tank, the only sound. I remember thinking how far it had gone, how something as small as an HOA dispute had turned into a battle for safety. Every knock at the door made my heart race. I barely slept, always waiting for the next violation notice, the next act of intimidation. Then came the envelope that changed everything. This time, it wasn't printed, it was handwritten, with my name scrawled across the front. Inside, there was no letterhead, no official seal, just a single line in neat, deliberate handwriting. If you don't comply, the next notice won't be a warning. That was when fear turned into resolve. I stopped waiting for help. I started preparing for war. Cameras hidden, documents copied, complaints filed with state authorities. I even installed a small motion alarm in the shed just in case, because I knew, deep down, the next move wouldn't be just another letter. And I was right. The night it finally happened, the air felt different, heavy, electric, like the calm before a storm. I was inside reading when the faint hiss of air broke the silence. At first, I thought it was my tank leaking, but when I turned toward it, my stomach dropped. The line had been pulled. Again. Only this time, it wasn't subtle. Whoever did it wanted me to know. I stumbled toward the window, gasping, trying to reconnect the valve as my backup kicked in. Through the haze, I caught sight of a figure retreating into the shadow, small frame, short blonde hair, clipboard glinting under the porch light. Karen. My pulse pounded as I steadied my breath, staring out into the night. I didn't know how she got close again, or how far she'd go next, but I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal, and as I picked up my phone to dial for help, I realized the line had already been cut. The call wouldn't go through. Outside, somewhere in the dark, I could hear footsteps on the gravel, slow, deliberate, fading into silence. That's when I understood this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The night the line was cut was the moment something inside me snapped. Fear had lived in my chest for so long that it had become a rhythm, but that night it turned into something else, clarity. I realized that Karen wasn't going to stop, because no one had ever made her answer for what she'd done. The HOA, the neighbors, even the local authorities, everyone looked away because it was easier to keep the illusion of order than to confront the truth. But I was done being quiet. I was done being compliant. That night, after catching my breath and restoring the oxygen flow, I pulled up the footage from my hidden backup camera, the one she didn't know existed. For days I had suspected she was slipping onto my property, so I'd installed a miniature device tucked inside a porch light. And there she was, clear as day, The camera had caught her creeping up to the tank, gloved hands pulling the cord free, eyes darting toward my windows before she disappeared into the shadows. My heart raced not just with shock, but with vindication. I finally had proof, but I knew better than to confront her immediately. I wanted the truth to surface where she couldn't twist it, couldn't smile her way out of it. So I began to plan. For the next 3 days, I acted like nothing had happened. I let her think she'd won. More notices appeared on my to reach, one colder than the last, each one quoting some obscure section of HOA policy she claimed I'd violated. But behind the calm, I was building a case. I made copies of every letter, every email, every recorded word. I contacted a local investigative reporter who specialized in HOA corruption stories. I sent her the footage anonymously at first, explaining only that a homeowner's life had been endangered by HOA interference. She replied within hours, her tone urgent. "This needs to go public." We agreed to meet that Friday, right before the monthly HOA meeting. The timing was perfect. By then, Karen had already prepared to unveil her biggest move yet, a board vote to declare my property non-compliant beyond reasonable remediation, which would allow the HOA to pursue forced lien action. Essentially, they wanted to take my home. But what she didn't know was that I had something far stronger than rules on my side. When Friday came, I could feel the tension even before I stepped into the meeting room. The air was thick with whispers. Karen stood at the front of the table, clipboard in hand, flanked by her loyal board members. "We're here to address ongoing violations," she began, her tone sharp and rehearsed. I watched her eyes flicker toward me, cold satisfaction flashing behind her smile. "This resident has repeatedly refused compliance, jeopardizing both safety and aesthetics." She motioned for me to speak, but I didn't. Not yet. I let her continue. Let her words dig her own grave. Then, when she finished her monologue about community harmony, I stood and placed a small USB drive on the table. "Before you continue," I sighed calmly, "you should probably see this." Her smirk faltered. The reporter, seated quietly in the back, pretending to be a new homeowner, lifted her camera. I pressed play on the projection screen. The footage rolled. Silence filled the room as the grainy video played. Karen, under cover of darkness, creeping up to my porch, reaching for the oxygen tank, unplugging it, and looping the cord deliberately. A collective gasp rippled through the room. For the first time, she looked small-cornered, pale, speechless. She stammered something about video manipulation and out-of-context footage. But it was too late. The reporter stood, revealing her badge, announcing that she was recording for a segment on HOA misconduct. Karen froze, her composure cracking. Her allies on the board looked horrified, backing away from her table. I felt my pulse surge with every second of silence. For months, she had dictated every rule, controlled every detail, silenced every voice, but now, the power she clung to was slipping through her fingers. When the meeting ended, she stormed out, muttering threats about defamation and lawsuits. But her voice no longer carried authority. The neighbor she once commanded wouldn't even look at her. For the first time, I felt the air shift, not from fear, but from release. I knew this wasn't the end, though. People like her don't surrender and I was right. That night, as I returned home, I noticed something strange, a flicker of lights from my shed, the one with the motion alarm I'd installed weeks before. My phone buzzed with an alert. Motion detected. I opened the feed. The figure in the shed wasn't a stranger. It was her. Again. When I saw her inside my shed, something in me turned cold and steady. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I picked up my phone, dialed the police, and kept my eyes on the live feed. She was rummaging through storage boxes, searching for something, maybe the camera, maybe documents. When the sirens finally broke the quiet, she didn't run this time. She froze, realizing too late that she'd been caught again on camera, in my space, violating the very laws she claimed to uphold. The officers led her out of the shed as she tried to spin a story about inspections and community safety, but it didn't matter anymore. The evidence was overwhelming. The footage from that night, combined with the earlier recording, painted a clear picture: premeditated harassment, trespassing, and endangerment. The next morning, the story went public. The news segment aired with the headline, HOA President Accused of Endangering Resident S Life. The clip went viral. Comments poured in from across the country. People outraged that something so personal, so cruel, could happen under the guise of neighborhood governance. The HOA board dissolved within a week. Karen was removed from her position, pending investigation. But even as the media storm raged, I couldn't shake the image of her standing in my shed still, believing, even then, that she had the right to be there. That's the thing about control. It blinds people. It convinces them that their rules are law, their authority unshakable. But once that illusion breaks, it crumbles fast. The neighbors who once avoided me now approached cautiously, offering apologies, baked goods, awkward smiles. Some confessed they'd been afraid to speak up. Others admitted they'd been fined too. I listened, accepted their words, but I couldn't forget how quickly they'd turned away when it mattered. Karen's arrest didn't feel like victory, it felt like survival. The day after the story aired, I walked through the neighborhood, breathing the cold morning air through the hiss of my tank, each step heavier with everything that had happened. The lawns were still perfect. The mailboxes still painted. The world still pretending to be peaceful, but something underneath had changed. The illusion of harmony was gone, replaced by quiet shame. And as I reached my porch, I saw something taped to my Duran envelope, handwritten again. My pulse quickened as I opened it, half expecting another threat. But inside was a single photograph. It was from the HOA archives, my house, years ago, with a note scribbled on the back. Rules keep people safe. No signature. But I didn't need one. Even from wherever she was now, Karen couldn't resist one last attempt to justify herself. I looked at that photo for a long time before tearing it in half, because the truth was, rules don't keep people safe. Decency does, and no amount of power, paper, or position could ever change that. As the sun began to rise, I set the torn pieces on the porch and let the wind carry them away. The war was over, but its echoes would linger in every trimmed hedge and polished mailbox of Willow Creek. And somewhere, deep down, I knew this story wasn't just mine anymore. It was every homeowner's reminder that sometimes the fight for peace starts right where others demand control. Because in the end, the loudest sound in a neighborhood built on silence is the moment truth finally speaks. When the last fragment of that torn photograph fluttered off the porch and disappeared into the wind, I thought that would be the end of it. I thought the silence that followed would feel like peace. But peace isn't something that simply appears when the noise stops. It's something you rebuild, piece by piece, after the dust settles and the truth is left bare. 4 weeks after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood of Willow Creek was unrecognizable. The manicured lawns still gleamed, the driveways were still spotless, and the mailboxes still stood in their perfect little rosebud. The people had changed. The quiet smiles were gone, replaced with glances heavy with guilt, curiosity, or shame. The ones who once clung to every rule now walked slower, unsure of how to act without someone dictating every move. The HOA office sat empty, its windows dark, a notice of administrative suspension taped to the door. I passed it one morning on my way to pick up mail, and for the first time, I felt something close to relief, not triumph, not joy, just the absence of fear. It was strange how something so simple could feel revolutionary. The local news didn't let the story fade quickly. 4 days. Headlines kept the HOA's name alive. Willow Creek scandal. HOA president charged with criminal negligence. Community faces reckoning over power abuse. Homeowners evidence exposes pattern of harassment. My name wasn't mentioned publicly at first, by request, but that didn't stop people from finding out. Neighbors began leaving notes in my mailbox, some apologetic, others supportive. One note stood out, written in delicate handwriting. "You gave us back our courage." I read it twice and folded it away. Maybe they were right, or maybe they just needed someone else to stand up first before they remembered they could. Over the following months, the community underwent an uncomfortable transformation. Without Karen's iron grip, the board dissolved, and an interim committee of residents was formed. For the first time, decisions were made in open meetings, with voices that had once been silent now filling the room. People debated, disagreed, sometimes even shouted, but it was honest, human, and real. There were no more secret fines, no hidden agendas, no quiet punishments disguised as policy. Change, I learned, doesn't arrive with applause. It comes slowly, awkwardly, like sunlight breaking through a heavy fog. I started to breathe easier, both literally and figuratively. The tank still hissed softly beside me every night, a reminder of fragility and survival, but it no longer symbolized fear. It was just part of life, my life, and no one had the power to make me feel ashamed of it anymore. But the real transformation wasn't in me. It was in the people around me. The neighbor who once ignored me started waving again. The elderly couple who'd been fined for their garden invited me to dinner. Even the man who used to cross the street to avoid me stopped one morning to ask, "You think they'll ever bring the HOA back?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Maybe, but not like it was." He nodded, as if that was enough. A few months later, I was asked to speak at a community meeting. I didn't want to at first. The thought of standing in front of the same people who once judged me felt heavy, but something inside said I needed to do it not for recognition, but for closure. So I went. The room was packed, the air warm and buzzing with conversation. When I stood up, the noise settled into silence. I never wanted to be the person at the center of all this. I began. I just wanted to live in peace like everyone else. But sometimes peace requires confrontation. Sometimes doing nothing gives power to the wrong people. I'm not asking anyone to forget what happened. I'm asking us to remember it so it never happens again. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was genuine. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet release, like a knot finally loosening. The next morning, when I stepped outside, the air felt lighter. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying a sound I hadn't heard in months. Laughter. It came from the neighbor's yard across the street. It wasn't much, but it was something. A beginning. Years passed, and the memory of what happened in Willow Creek slowly became a story people told new homeowners when they moved in. The incident, as they called it, was reduced to whispers and cautionary lessons about power and control. The HOA was restructured under new leadership, a committee of volunteers rather than enforcers. Meetings were shorter, rules were simpler, and the focus shifted from punishment to preservation. They even amended the bylaws to include a new clause, one that I helped write. No policy shall override the rights or dignity of an individual. It wasn't much on paper, but it meant everything to me. I still lived in the same house, still kept the same garden, still watched the same sunsets from my porch. The world didn't erase what happened, but it moved forward, and so did I. Occasionally, I'd see glimpses of the old ways in small moments, a complaint about lawn height, a debate about mailbox colors, but now, those moments ended with laughter, not threats. People had learned something, even if they didn't realize it. The last I heard of Karen, she had moved several towns away. The charges against her didn't vanish quietly. They stayed on record. She avoided jail through a plea deal, but lost her ability to serve on any community board. Some said she still tried to start another HOA, but no one wanted to follow her lead. That was her punishment. Not just the legal kind, but the social kind. The world she built on fear had no place left to exist. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about her not with anger, but with a strange kind of pity. Control had been her purpose, and without it, she was just another person lost in her own need for power. I didn't forgive her, but I no longer let her live rent-free in my mind. The true victory wasn't her downfall, was my peace. One evening, a young couple moved into the house next door. They were full of excitement, asking about the neighborhood, the rules, the history. I smiled and told them, just remember, it's not the rules that make a neighborhood. It's the people who decide how to live by them. They nodded, not fully understanding, but one day they would. As the sun dipped low, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, the steady rhythm of the oxygen tank beside me, like a heartbeat. The same hum that once symbolized fear now sounded like life, a reminder of what I'd survived. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the story was bigger than me. It was about every homeowner who's ever felt powerless against systems meant to protect them. It was about courage born from desperation, truth born from silence, and freedom earned through standing firm. The neighborhood had found its balance again, not perfect, but human. The fences still stood, but now they divided space, not hearts. Rules still existed, but now they served, not ruled. And as the wind carried through Willow Creek, brushing the trees, and chiming the porch bells, I finally understood something simple yet profound. Sometimes justice doesn't come as thunder or applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the stillness of peace, after the storm has passed. Because true victory isn't winning a battle. It's reclaiming the right to breathe freely in your own home. And as I sat there watching the lights flicker across the street, I whispered to myself the line that had come to define everything that happened here. Control may silence a neighborhood, but truth will always find its voice.